Hi, my name is David. In this series, we're working through the Lord's Prayer, paying a lot of attention to what's in the guts and the detail of the prayer. In the previous video in this series, we talked about the words, "Thy kingdom come." And in this video, my intent is to talk about the next line, "Thy will be done." So we had "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." But really, as I think we'll see, we need to address both of these concepts, God's kingdom and His will, as two parts of an inseparable whole. I got to throw a word of caution in here. God's kingdom and His will, these are spiritual things. And descriptive language does not do well in describing spiritual matters. So we resort to things like talking about castles or tops of mountains or Elysian fields and places like that. It gives us a picture, but it fails to convey the whole concept. So for that purpose, the language we need to turn to is the language that we call metaphor. Metaphor happens when thing A is not the same thing as thing B, but when we talk about A and B together, and often, after time we begin to associate them as though the two were talking about the same thing. So an example in our everyday language would be the word sunrise. Think about it. Sun stays still, earth goes around, but we look out the window and see the sun coming up. All that stuff's going on. They're different things, but we associate them with the same phenomenon. So my thought is to use graphics to come at these terms, God's kingdom and God's will, from a different point of view, which is to say, a metaphorical point of view. And so, here we go. Let's start with some assertions. First, this circle represents all of existence, not time, except forever, and for always. Not distance, just everywhere. Not detail, but just everything. Second assertion, for this universe of everything, there is an intelligible source. If there is no intelligible source, then existence itself would be an absurdity. That would simply mean nothing to talk about at all. So I'm left with believing that there is an intelligible source. It's just beyond my understanding what the nature of that intelligible source is. Faith can give me an explanation of what the intelligible source might be, but faith is a human endeavor, and I'm not there in my assertions yet. My third assertion is that this universe of everything is perfect. It's perfect because everything in it and everything about it is just as the intelligible source wills it to be. To put this into better terms, let's say God in place of intelligible source. And let's say God's kingdom in place of the universe of everything. And let's assert that God's kingdom is perfect because everything in it exists according to His will. And then let's say in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done." Okay, so how was that? Clear? Simple enough? We're saying that God's kingdom and God's will are two different aspects of the same thing. Two different aspects, same thing, God's kingdom and will. God's kingdom is perfect, and of course, we're part of that kingdom. But wait, you say, I live in this world, dude, and let me tell you, it's far from perfect. And I agree, my world's not so doggone perfect either. So we ask, what's going on here? Well, let's take a look. Here's our visual metaphor of God's kingdom, which exists according to God's will. But look, down here in this corner, there seems to be an anomaly. Let's say this anomaly is the earth. This is our temporal world. So let's make it bigger and take a closer look. Now let's make some assertions about this temporal world. First assertion, our world is dominated by time. Everything in this temporal world has to have a beginning, and everything in this world has to have an end. Everything in this temporal world has to be born, and everything has to die. Those are the rules, and they rule everything. Second assertion, our existence within this temporal world is monitored through our 5 senses. Sometimes what they bring us is genuine joy and pleasure, like the sound of a child's laugh, or a warm embrace, or the aroma of home cooking. But at other times, our senses mislead us. They make us want things that we can't have. They make us susceptible to cravings, too, to craving things that, like alcohol and drugs, are cunning, baffling, and powerful. Things that literally can destroy our lives or even kill us. And our third assertion, which I refer to as the 7 deadly sins, looks like this. The 7 deadly sins are the sins that we become prey to as we form into societies. Here they are in their classical sequence: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, anger, and laziness. Now, you read these, think of unscrupulous politicians, things they do. Blind hatreds like ethnic warfare, bloody. Greedy financial barons who manipulate to take things behind our backs. And contemptuous religious potentates who use the power of faith for their own personal gain. And that list could go on, that's for sure. We can all recognize these behaviors we were looking at. The combination of these 3 key assertions, that our world is dominated by time, monitored by the strict limits of our 5 senses, and subject to the 7 deadly sins that we seem to generate when we get into societies. These things combined wrap us in a shroud. We can't get out. We're tied up in there. And taken all together, they make it seem all but impossible to share in any kind of magnificence that's out there beyond the circuit of these temporal walls. So what do we do? What do we do to avoid a dreary life whose only end is here and in our death? And what does all this have to do with the Lord's Prayer anyway? So let's go back to our talk about metaphor. Remember this universe of everything that we talked about, where everything is perfect? And then this other temporal world? These are 2 different things. A is not the same thing as B. Logically, we can't merge them. We can't make a heaven which is timeless and perfect, a heaven on earth, out of this temporal world which is dominated by time and ruled by our senses and governed by our deadly sins. But thinking in metaphors allows us to believe that there's far more to life than we've ever realized before. Certainly than we've ever realized in this temporal world before. I believe that inside each of us is the embryo of a yearning, spiritually genuine human being, just waiting to break through the restraints that surround us in this temporal life. in a metaphorical world, which is a spiritual world, we can have these two separate things, A and B. We can have these two separate things merge toward each other. And based on our genuine faith in that belief, we can take actions to break through the limitations of our temporal world, to strike through them and to soar past them. And while we'll never, ever achieve that final goal of spiritual perfection, we can dedicate ourselves to a life of continuous spiritual progress toward what we call a life filled with self-rediscovery and redemption. And that's what we pray for when we say, "Thy kingdom come, and thy will be done on earth, just as it is in heaven." Now, this leaves us with the question of how do we make spiritual progress like that? What are the rules? What are the steps we take? What are the guidelines that we follow and are limited by? And these are all good questions. And those are the questions we'll address in our next video, and I look forward to seeing you then.